Hello, lovely sewing friends. I hope you guys are doing well. So, I have discovered something, and it is a revitalization of my sojo. So, if you're new to sewing and don't know what sojo is, it's basically your sewing motivation. So, I found that I've been able to do a lot more creativity work and whatnot over the past week or so, and I've been looking at patterns. I really want to sew a rain jacket, right? Excuse me if I keep on touching my nose. Hay fever in Melbourne is at its peak, so I do have tissues on standby. But anyway, I really want to start sewing more things for my wardrobe because apart from like the odd t-shirt and whatnot, I've not really sewn to myself for a while, and that is because I just had enough clothes to make do with. But I think over the last, like year and a half to 2 years, my style has evolved quite a bit, and I've kind of matured in it, and now I'm looking for a couple of different things in my wardrobe. For example, I now go into an office space 5 days a week. I want to look presentable. I want to look good. I want to wear things that I look good, feel good, and have made. So I think this afternoon what I'm going to do is sit down and kind of like look at where the gaps are in my wardrobe. For example, I do not have a raincoat. I've been wanting to sew myself a raincoat for years. I have the fabric, right? And it's in this color, so it's perfect. So I want to make that. So keep me accountable. Anyway, how are you? I hope you're doing well. So today's video is going to be about sewing with different types of fabrics and like these little tips and tricks that I have learned from experience when sewing with them, because my gosh, when you start sewing with a new fabric for the first time, it is the most frustrating thing ever, because you're like, I don't know why this isn't working. I don't know why I keep on getting a bird's nest. I don't know why it keeps on jamming, and I don't know why my stitches are puckering. So I'm just going to cut to the chase, and we're going to go through a couple of the key points that you need to remember when you're starting to sew a new fabric. So the first one we're going to start out with is a satin. So for those of you who don't know, a satin is the finish that a piece of fabric gets, and it's a little bit shiny. So have I got a coat available? No. So a satin, that doesn't really show up really well on the camera. A satin is something that has a sheen to it, right? So that sheen doesn't necessarily have to be a silk satin, because it can be a polyester satin or a viscose satin. It's just that slippery texture on top. So when you are sewing with a satin, there are a couple things you're going to have to take into account. First of all, the needle. Do not try and sew a satin with a regular universal needle, because, right, satin has a slippery surface, right? It will glide a lot more obviously than if you're sewing with like a linen or a cotton like that. So what you're going to want to do is change your universal needle out for like a sharps needle. What that will do is, first of all, having a new needle when you're sewing a new project, especially like something as delicate as a satin, always a good idea. And also what it will do is it will glide in between the fibers of your fabric instead of piercing them and pulling them. So that if you are sewing along and you're sewing with a blunt needle, the way you can tell, number one, you can hear it's a thud rather than like a slip up and down. Secondly, you can feel the fabric when it's being pulled, like cinch up. Or another way is if you have a piece of fabric with a pattern like this, you'll be sewing along and then all of a sudden the thread will pull and you'll visually see it. So like, let's say example, I'm sewing the hem of these shorts and sewing along, thread gets pulled and then this green will shoot down, right? Just in that fiber, but it's very visible. So that is one thing that you'll need to remember when you're sewing with a satin. Another one, I mentioned this in one of my previous videos, I think it was last week, but I have a range of different scissors and they all have their different uses. For example, these ones from Clover have little teeth along the bottom. That is super, super useful when I'm sewing with a satin because of one, it just holds the fabric in there. So I'm going along cutting, I'll slide this under and then I can kind of position my scissors. Really good. And then also as I close my scissors and the top blade comes down, it holds the fabric in place on these teeth, so it's actually accurate. Whereas with another pair of scissors like these ones, right? They're both really smooth blades. Don't worry about my fingers, they're fine. They're really smooth blades, so they kind of, as they come down on the fabric, they can shift it ever so slightly. And that's with normal fabric, let alone a satin. So if you have them, use a pair of like scissors with a pair of teeth along the bottom. Just helps. It just helps. Just helps. The other thing is pins. So I've got these ones from Birch. So these are berry pins. They're basically just like a regular pin. However, they are a little bit finer than your normal pins. And that is because these are ones that I use for really delicate work. You can get specific silks pins, but the times that I sew with a really delicate silk or a satin, somewhat rare. So I personally like to keep the pins that will be used for like delicate fabrics to one side, because I would hate to use them. Like these are my universal ones. These are ones I use all the time. I would hate to use these ones on this fabric and risk it pulling, because what you'll notice with your regular pins over time, first of all, they get dull on the end. Second of all, they might get a little, not a tear, but like a little gash in them. And as you're inserting or removing your pin from your fabric, it can pull the fabric and the little fibers. So I like to avoid that. So I tend to just keep not necessarily sharps, silk pins to one side, but like my good quality pins to one side for those kinds of projects. Now, so satin is number one. Number two is a stretch fabric. So this is a merino piece I've got here. So a stretch fabric can be anything from a lycra, a merino, a cotton t-shirting, a ribbing, perhaps sportswear even. So one of the things you may need if you are sewing with a stretch fabric is a walking foot. Now a walking foot, best way to describe a walking foot is basically as it goes along. Let's imagine I'm a little sewing machine foot. Basically, your feed dogs do this as you sew along, right? Let's do a universal foot. So a universal foot will kind of stay in one place as the fabric is being fed through. A walking foot, on the other hand, right? So it will come up, over, and bring the fabric through as the feed dogs do as well. So it's kind of like a mirrored effect. It goes like that, right? So, I'm a little teapot. So what that does essentially is it eases the fabric through. It doesn't kind of like eat it all up in one go. And the best way that kind of works is for your knit fabrics. So I personally don't own one because instead of owning a walking foot, I own an overlocker that essentially does the same type of job, but it also loops the raw edge of the fabric. If you don't have access to a walking foot or don't use stretch fabric that often, a zigzag stitch is another great alternative, because when you sew with knitwear, you can see here the fabric needs to stretch, right? So what you need to do is make sure that your stitches, if you just sew straight, what happens is that as the fabric stretches, your stitches will strain and they will either degrade over time or they will pop. So by popping, I mean like they'll snap. And then you have to resew it anyway. So instead of doing a walking foot, you can do a zigzag stitch. So that's two alternatives. Now, if you are like me, and I do not like a zigzag for my seam allowance, I will do a straight stitch. However, I will not use like a regular sewing machine thread. I will use an elasticated thread, right? Now, they are out there, lots of different brands, but I have personally tried the Metla one. That was good, but I would say if you are going to use a stretch thread, get a walking foot, because what I found with my Metla thread when I was sewing straight on with a regular sewing machine foot is that I would set my sewing machine stitch length to normal, which is like 2.5, 3, but the stitches would come out like at a size like 1.5, 2, so they were very small, which resulted in them like either having a bird's nest or popping eventually anyway. And I think that's because I wasn't using a walking foot. Another thing you've got to take into consideration with knit fabrics is that you are going to want to use a ballpoint needle, right? This serves another purpose similar to when we were changing our needles for our silk and our satins, is that you don't want your needle to pierce the actual fiber of the thread of your fabric and yank it. Ballpoint needles work really well because the softer, the more kind of like the ballpointness of the needle, as it goes down, it'll slip in between fibers rather than pierce them. Whereas with a silk's needle, it's designed to go in between the fibers by being really slim. You can use a silk's needle for multiple different fabrics. However, I wouldn't use it on heavy duty stuff because they do have this tendency to snap because they're not designed to be as strong. Whereas with a ballpoint needle, I wouldn't use it on other fabrics rather than a stretch, purely because this is kind of designed for a stretch fabric because of its ballpointness. If you are going to use this on any other type of fabric, it'll usually leave like an indentation or a mark or a hole because it is designed to kind of, have the fabric stretch in and out. So that kind of hides the holes anyway, is my assumption. So ballpoint needles, really good. Now the next one. Oh my gosh. So when you're sewing heavy duty fabric, right? Like denim, right? First of all, I do not like sewing heavy duty fabric purely on the basis that I've had a bad history with them. And I'm not going to hide that. So I'm very biased. However, I decided to engage with curiosity for once with my sewing, and I decided to retry a sewing technique that I had for the past 5 years cursed the name of, and that is top stitching, right? So for those of you who don't know, I made a jumpsuit about 5 years ago, and I thought I was doing top stitching right. I was not. Okay? So now that I've learned how to do it, which is you only wind the bobbin Or was it the top stitch? No, that was it. Let's rewind. You are supposed to put the top stitching thread as the top part of your sewing machine setup, and then your bobbin is the regular thread. You do not put this on your bobbin. It screwed up my machine so bad. Do as I say, not as I do, right? So only put this as the top, not the bottom, and it made all the difference, right? I'm not even joking. I'm no longer mad at top stitching. I'm mad at myself for not trying different things out to make top stitching work. So top stitching, really good for decorative stitches on your denim or even your wool, perhaps your heavy duty coats and your wools. So denim, you usually use top stitching, and I personally, because the fabric is thicker, I would increase my stitch length probably like half. So let's say you normally sew in 2.5, you'll increase it to 3. If you normally sew in 3, increase it to 3.5. Because I feel like it actually gives the illusion, because the fabric is so thick, it gives the illusion that as you create stitches, because the fabric is thicker, that the spacing is correct. Let me know if that makes sense. But I personally prefer to have a longer stitch length, especially if I'm sewing with a thicker fabric like a wool. So that's one thing. If you are sewing with a thick fabric, choose a leather needle. Right. Same kind of thing with the other two. Leather needles are designed for heavy duty thick fabric. They're the kind of bar, shaft, whatever you want to call it, is a lot thicker and a lot more durable for sewing through thicker fabrics. Nobody wants to be replacing 3 or 4 universal needles because they weren't strong enough. Just go for a leather needle. And like these kinds of things cost like $5 a pack. And I've been sewing 20 years. I think you don't go through too many needles. You really, really don't. It's kind of like an overlocking cone. You buy them once and then 8 years later you need to replace them. Like, you're fine. Like, just invest in good quality needles. I obviously get mine from Birch. So that's the needle. So for heavy duty fabrics, I will tend to just use my universal needles. You can get like these really like strong, durable. Oh, look at my pretty nails. What color will she have next week? We will never know, because she doesn't know yet. So these are thicker pins. So you can use that. Well, let's just compare them. Like if we just compare these two pins side by side, these ones are a little bit thicker. You can already see the thickness of the pins is more noticeable, and also it's longer. And also the head on these pins is a lot easier to grab out. Fun fact, whenever I'm sewing, I like to have my nails, you can see how long they are just behind, like there. And then what I like to do is as I'm sewing, I kind of catch it with my nail and flick it out like that. I just find it super easy. So if you want to give that a go. And then when it comes to cutting out your fabric, you use these ones. The weight of these scissors. The weight of these scissors will make cutting out your fabric so much more easier. So yeah, like I've done a run through on my scissors in a previous video. So if you want to know more about that, go and have a look. But yeah, I'm pretty well versed with sewing with different types of fabrics. I have never sewn with any like fur or anything with a pile. So a pile means like a directional kind of texture on it. So like a fur, a boucle, a velvet. And there are so many tricks that you can do. For example, I've seen one person like put clear matte tape over the back of a fabric that was difficult for them to sew with because it kept on sliding around. It might have been a silk, satin or something. And that makes it easier to sew with. Some people put tissue paper in between their fabric and then tear it away once they've sewn it. So there are so many tips and tricks you can do when you come to sew your fabric. For example, with a lightweight fabric like a silk or a rayon or a viscose or something sheer, you're going to use like a starch spray perhaps. Whereas with a fabric that's really lightweight but not transparent, you might want to cut out some fusing in 1.5 centimeter strips and put that along the seam allowances and everything. There are so many things that go in to making fabric easier to work with. So if you're ever stuck, you know, pop your questions down below, because I'm sure there are people in the sewing community that have dealt with it exactly like you have. But yeah, I think there's a great place to end. Keeping it like, okay, I'll just quickly let you in on this. So I've got to finish my rain jacket. But this 2-piece set, I've been working on for over 2 years. So if you ever think you've got projects that need finishing, join my club. Goodbye.